Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Kristen Smith. As the 250th anniversary of America's founding approaches, American democracy suffers from a lack of trust and imagination. So declared NPR CEO and President Katherine Maher during a TED event on the future of modern American democracy at Philadelphia's National Constitution Center. Joining me today is the Center Square's Pennsylvania reporter, Anthony Hennon. Anthony, so you were there at the TED Talk and spent a lot of time listening to Maher talk about the history of where this country has come from founding to now and kind of how that ties in with the state of democracy. So as best you can, try to sum that up.
Yeah, so, this is a first in a series of events that TED will be doing in Philadelphia, basically looking at the state and future of our modern democracy. This one was officially titled TED Democracy, Fireside Chat of Living in a Democracy. A lot of democracies in there. But basically, it's this idea that, as we're coming up to the 250th anniversary of the founding in 2026, where do we go from here? What are the tensions and the problems and the successes of American democracy? What do we do? And so Maher was really focused on this idea of the need to rebuild trust and to, really understand the imagination in democracy and, the responsibilities and duties of citizens. She said, the United States was a revolutionary act of politics, but it was also a revolutionary act of imagination. A nation is an imagined community, and no nation has ever been more thoroughly imagined, perhaps, than this one. Its future citizens had to build a vision of what it meant. They needed an idea to bind the nation together beyond tribal or religious or legal ties. And so she was really focused on this idea of, with so many Americans no longer feeling that they have a stake or an equal say in democracy, when we see the collapse of public confidence in all sorts of institutions, how do you rebuild this? How do you move away from disenfranchisement? How do you get people working together and really believing in the concept of American democracy again? So unsurprisingly, she's calling for renewed civic engagement to help rebuild local trust. But she was really insistent on this idea that the key to democracy is collaboration and coexistence and seeing each other as equals and working together on this local level. Because when you have local trust, you can basically build that up to what she called a vital scaffolding for our democracy to go from trust in local institutions and people to a more abstract national trust and belief in the country.
So you're talking a lot about local journalism. NPR is anything but local. So where does she see NPR fitting into this construct that she's made?
Yeah, NPR is, it's national, it's local. They have thousands of journalists all across. And as we've seen a lot of local papers go under, reduced staffs, et cetera, as we've seen throughout the journalism industry. She kind of sees NPR's place as being able to bridge some of these divides. Some places you have the state paper, you have a local NPR station, and that's mostly it. You might have maybe one small local paper if you're lucky, but she sees NPR's reach here as being able to go out and rebuild this trust, because when people are actually interacting with local journalists, they tend to trust it more and engage more. And she sees NPR's role as one where, they have the resources, they have the training, they have all this expertise they can then send out into these local areas and help rebuild this back up and really pull people away from, this urge to become cynical or become disengaged. Basically underlying this idea of we can't have a functioning republic or democracy without people actually, volunteering their time, of keeping local politicians in check, of keeping abreast of what news is happening in your community, in your region, in your state. And so the more that journalism can serve to further that mission or connect these lines, connect people, the more that you can really rebuild American democracy.
So it's interesting that she brings up restoring trust. We all know that over the last decade, major media outlets have been repeatedly accused of, in particular, left-leaning biases. And, New York Times, Washington Post, those come to mind. But NPR has actually been no stranger to this criticism, right?
Yeah, this is not exactly a new criticism of NPR, but I think in recent years it's become more heated or a bigger deal, I suppose. Yeah, I can remember going back more than a decade of conservatives have long criticized NPR for being left-wing or having a bias or not treating things equally. But I think especially since 2016, since 2020, a lot of that has gotten much more acute and it's become much more glaring. Earlier this year, in April, NPR was actually publicly criticized by their senior business editor, Uri Berliner, basically for losing America's trust because they have, quote, told listeners how to think. This did not necessarily go down easy within NPR. His colleagues were very angry and publicly upset about this. Berliner got a formal rebuke and a 5-day suspension, and then he resigned from the network. And again, I think listening to NPR, and NPR is not necessarily a outlet that represents the median American. Generally, it tends to be a wealthier cohort, a wider cohort. There's a lot going on there. But at the same time, people were defending NPR, but people were also calling out the change in the network's tenor in recent years, not just from right-wing sources. Jack Schafer, who's a media critic for Politico, when all the Berliner stuff was going down in April, he wrote, "As is often the case when employers punish their workers, Berliner's transgression was not as much about what he did, write an outside piece without permission, but what he said. Let's not kid ourselves. He was docked a week's pay for his message, not his conduct." And I think that really kind of shows that, NPR leadership may not necessarily agree with this idea that they're losing trust from listeners or the median American, or that, they disagree that they have any sort of bias. But anyone reading them, you tend to see, if not bias, you see some fairly significant changes in recent years. And I think the future for them, like we see the future for a lot of other journalistic outlets, is finding a way to, regain trust from readers, to get more readers, and to keep giving that public service of holding power to account, of keeping a tab on what politicians are doing, of what large corporations are doing, et cetera, et cetera.
Anthony, thanks for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.